Good morning. We are here in el Colegio de México, leading Institute of Research of Social Sciences and Humanities in Mexico, with Professor Saurab Dube. He is a research professor of the Center for Asian and African Studies of el Colegio de México. And this morning we will be talking about his book, recent book, Subjects of Modernity. Professor Dube, we're very happy to have you here.
Well, thank you.
Professor Dube is research professor, and here in the Colegio, he's also a member of the Sistema Nacional de Investigadores, which is the main institution which for research professors in Mexico. He has been a Guggenheim Fellow. He has been professor in England and United States, in Germany, in India. He's published many books, and including Untouchable Pasts, 1998, 2001, Stitches on Time, After Conversion, 2010, and Subjects of Modernity, which is this book that we're discussing today. He's also been editor of about 15 works, 15 books on subjects, varied subjects. They're mainly on history, anthropology, philosophy, cultural studies, and today he's going to talk to us about some of these subjects, particularly in this new book. So, first question: this book deals with subjects of modernity. Now, you insist on the distinctions between modernity and modernization, and also on the modern subject and the subjects of modernity. Now, could you talk to us a little bit about, explain to us what you're reflecting on?
Certainly. But first of all, thank you very much, Carlos. It's a pleasure to be in this conversation with you. And you'd know that I've been a great admirer of both of your work and your presence at El Colegio de México. So it's a particular pleasure and privilege to be in this conversation. Now, going to your questions about the distinction between modernity and modernization on the one hand, and modern subjects and subjects of modernity on the other, these are extremely important questions which run through both this work, as its title, Subjects of Modernity, would show, but also which run through a lot of my writing and thinking across the boundaries of history and anthropology, and to a certain extent social theory, over the last 20 years. So, going to the issue of modernity and modernization, one must begin with the proposition that it's necessary to distinguish between the two, because very often in academic arenas as well as in everyday worlds, modernity and modernization are elided, collapsed one with the other. And this has to do with particular ways in which both modernization and modernity are understood. And these are sort of understandings which I actually differ from, and which is what I'm going to elaborate now. So, by modernization, I mean, they've been, modernization is something which academics speak of, but modernization is something which is spoken about as well by leaders of nations. Every nation wants to modernize. So it's not just a category which is academic, it's a category which is of the world, of politics. People on the street talk about modernized Mexico or modernized India, etc., etc. So what is it that I understand by modernization? Now, despite these many sort of usages of modernization, I actually take modernization back to its mid-20th century formulations. And particularly important, and these mid-20th century formulations actually came up in the context of the Cold War. And particularly pertinent here was a small book, a booklet actually, by a Cold War ideologue in the United States called W.W. Rostow. And W. Rostow wrote a book which was subtitled An Anti-Communist Manifesto. So you know where he was going with that. Now what Rostow was basically, what modernization meant for Rostow and how it's come to be crystallized after is modular schemes of step-by-step development of principally hierarchically graded societies. Societies, cultures which were once traditional or pre-modern, moving through steps to become a modernized or capitalist order. Now these were changes which were, for one part, these were changes which were material, organizational, technological, and concomitant, and in a related way, economic, social, and political. So the idea was that each society rises in a step-by-step way from its traditional or pre-modern circumstance to become a modernized order. And this modernized order was, of course, seen in the image of a very rarefied, yet very imaginary, a very palpable, but totally imagined Europe or the West. And it was in the mirror of this Europe or West that each society was seen as rising to, as moving towards that horizon or failing there. Now, there's something very tendentious about the step-by-step kind of evolutionary ordering which went into modernization theory. And so in academics, modernization came to be discussed, but it also came to be rejected. And yet, notions of modernization didn't remain solely in academic arenas. They became a part of everyday worlds, as we saw, taken up by middle-class subjects, taken up by subaltern subjects, but also particularly harped upon by nations and states as a part of their developmental thinking. So basically, modernization has come to be, if we might put it this way, it has come to be made of the world. It has been worlded, right? Now, I've just mentioned that modernization is very tendentious, and yet it carries resonances for the understanding of modernity. Why should this be the case? You can see that modernization, the notion of modernization, is premised upon a break, a rupture with tradition, with the pre-modern. Now this is where it carries resonances for modernity, because dominant understandings of modernity similarly posit a kind of a rupture with the past, a break with tradition, a surpassing of the medieval, right? And it's here that modernization comes to carry resonances for modernity, and the two are collapsed with each other. So whether you look at academic worlds or at scholarship, or you look at the language of states and people on the street, in a sense, there is an equation between modernity, modernization, and being modern. Now, this is where I would, this is where I'd like to posit that I think we need to think through these projections of modernity as a kind of a break with the past, whether you see it happening, after the Renaissance or after the Enlightenment or in the 20th century or whatever. Now, how do I understand modernity then? So, that would become crucial here. I see modernity as Janus-faced, as sort of double-faced. So it has these two faces which are conjoined one with the other. Which is what Janus-faced means, and I see modernity then not only in terms of an idea, an ideal, an ideology, but as involving historical processes of meaning and power. And this is crucial. Meaning and power go together. Now, what are these two phases of modernity understood as historical processes of meaning and power then? These historical processes of meaning and power go back actually to the last 5 centuries. In other words, modernity begins not just after the Enlightenment. Modernity begins after the Renaissance, but not just after the Renaissance. It begins after or with the empires of Spain and Portugal, and later the empires and colonies of France, Britain, and the new empires, as it were. So this should already introduce some sense of the Janus-faced nature of modernity that I'm speaking of. In other words, modernity is not just things which are nicey. Modernity is also carries an awful darker side. So on the one hand, I understand by modernity more familiar processes. These are processes of commerce and consumption. These are processes of state and the nation state and citizenship. These are processes of science and rationality. These are processes of disenchanted knowledges. And secularized worlds. Okay. Now, what I want to add here, however, is the following proposition, and the proposition is that care must be taken not to see, these processes of science and rationality, of commerce and consumption, democracy and citizenship as heroic histories. They are checkered. They are contradictory. That checkered contradictory histories at play here. Now, I'll just give 2 very quick instances here, and one of them concerns the fact that the great physicist, scientist, the crucial figure in the rise of science, Newton, is often presented as this trailblazing figure, right, who had nothing to do with anything which was about unreason. But people often forget that, Newton's other abiding interest at King's College in Cambridge, apart from physics and the sciences, was in alchemy, was in the turning of base metals into gold. Now, alchemy is decidedly seen as something which is about superstition. And I think we need to hold that part together. The second example is that we need to consider as well how the rise of democracy itself, whether it was France or whether it was Britain in the 18th, early 19th century, or it was the United States, was the rise of democracy was very closely bound to processes of slavery, right? So in other words, which brings up the question is that rather than see the rise of democracy as a kind of heroic history, we need to understand it in terms of the possibilities holds, but also the undemocratic foundations of the processes of democracy, right? So that's one part of it. But the other side, which is connected to this, which the question of slavery brings in, is that processes of modernity extending back to the last 5 centuries are also equally about race and genocide, about empires and colonies, about enchantments of the modern, and enchantments of the modern in terms of seductions of the state, in terms of seductions of markets. So I think, the 2 sides, this Janus-faced nature of modernity, the 2 sides need to be kept together. Now, this is where I've gone on a bit, but this is where the question of modern subjects and subjects of modernity comes in. These historical processes, which are double-sided, have not been subjectless procedures. It's not as if they've been created out of thin air. These processes have been created by subjects of modernity, by historical subjects, not just great men, not just great women, but by everyday subjects, right? By subaltern, middle-class subjects. Now, it's important to recognize here that when we think of the modern, when we think of modernity, we often think of it in the image of the modern subject. And who is this modern subject? This modern subject is usually, frequently, male, white, Western European, right? Not even Spanish or Portuguese or Italian,
right.
Western. It's again, it's a subject which is very imaginary, but very, very tangible. So modernity is seen in the image of this kind of a modern subject. So you become modern by wearing certain kinds of clothes. You become modern by, when you become sort of European, right? Now, against this, I'm suggesting, contra this, I'm suggesting that the processes of modernity need to be understood as created by subjects of modernity. What do I mean by subjects? I'm referring to the two notions of the subject, the two meanings of the term subject. A subject is subject to, so you're subject to the nation, you're subject to power, you're subject, you're acted upon by these processes of power, but also subject of, also the acting subject. And subjects, historical subjects of modernity have embodied these two attributes of subject to, modernity, empire, nation, but also subjects of, subjects creating empire, nation, modernity, and many other, democracy and other processes. Now, in this understanding, then, what does happen is that the subjects of modernity include not just the poets of the 19th century or the 18th century, not just the Enlightenment philosophers, but subjects of modernity include the slaves, the people of African diaspora, not a people of African descent, not just on that continent, but in the diaspora. Indigenous people in Latin America and across the world, the fourth world as it's known. So subjects of modernity are peasants. Subjects of modernity are also, of course, elite and middle class women and men. But there are different kinds of subjects of modernity, and they have created modernity by being subjects who acted, but also who've been subjected to these processes. So what I'm doing effectively is widening the range of address of modernity itself, and saying how it was created as a historical process. And this also means, this is to recognize that subjects of modernity have every now and then tried to become modern, but they've tried to become modern in different ways, right? But at other times, they have articulated these processes of modernity without bothering about the niceties of the modern subject. The Black Jacobins of Haiti are a particular example. But what this brings up also is that we need to get out of the particular way in which we think in exclusive, singular ways about modern subjects. So who, for me, is one of the quintessential modern subjects of the 20th century? It's actually the jazz trumpeter, Miles Davis. Miles Davis not only improvised all the time, as much as Charles Baudelaire did, the modern as the fleeting, as the transitory. I mean, Miles Davis's music was about at the cutting edge of improvisation, but he was also self-destructive, as an aspect of the double-sided nature of modernity. As a modern subject, he did shoot himself with heroin, as a part of his cutting-edge creativity. But what's often, so subjects are fashioned. And what's fabulous about Miles as an example, and what people often forget, is that Miles fashioned himself as a modern subject. He created the sloping side jacket at a time when everyone wore those, big padded things in the 1950s. So, he was an author, he was an author, he was a cutting-edge modern subject who was also a subject of modernity. He couldn't forget his vulnerability and his blackness. So I hope this...
Oh yes, it's very fascinating. It's also a vast and varied panorama that you open up on to understand what we mean by modernity or by modernization. These subjects are very large, and I think you've explained quite well some of your major concerns about how you change the way people think about modernity. Now, the second question that I would like to ask you is your method, because you're approaching this from a broad perspective, very broad questions, but you define yourself in some way, I think, as a historical anthropologist. Now, that means relating history and anthropology. What that implies is a major question. And that's particularly interesting for Mexico, because here there is much interest on that relationship between history and anthropology and what that tells us about life in general. How you can link that up. I mean, the creation of the INA, for instance, is an example. Mm-hmm. You apparently think that establishing the bridge between history and anthropology is important. Is it a method to look at the questions that you're looking at?
Well, thank you again. I mean, it's a fabulous question because, I mean, let me clarify that, you know, when I work as a historical anthropologist, or work on the cusp of history and anthropology, combining archival and field work, what I also want to do is to write different kinds of books. So this book, with its very large sort of scale or its large canvas, is in no way meant to be definitive. I think of it much more as a provocation to think, right? And I draw upon upon different bodies of literature in history, anthropology, the social sciences to do that. But other works of mine have focused on, particular peoples, on questions of evangelical entanglements, sort of subjects which are, or themes which are closer to historical anthropology or history and anthropology conventionally understood. But then this brings up the question of how, as which you've so presently put, of how do I understand historical anthropology itself? Now, the idea of a kind of conversation and interchange between history and anthropology has been around for a long time. People have talked about it in different ways. And we can think of Evans Pritchard here writing about it in the 1950s. Historians have, and anthropologists have also used each other's methods, right? Going back again to the 1950s, even to the 1940s. But at other moments, historians and anthropologists have simply talked past each other. They have showed very limited comprehension of each other's methods, of each other's sensibilities, and so on. Now, what happens then is that there is a particular manner of speaking about history, anthropology, and historical anthropology which comes into place, which is history and anthropology are understood as taken for granted disciplines. They are understood a priori. They're already there. They have their methods. And then the effort becomes somehow to combine. Okay? These taken for granted, virtually a priori disciplines with their methods, their techniques, and so on. I think, so the question becomes, what is historical anthropology is about the conversation or the dialogue between history and anthropology, already understood. My way of approaching historical anthropology, again, it's a sort of a provocation, but I think others have done it. It's actually to approach historical anthropology as a way of rethinking its constituent disciplines, right? It's to put a question mark on the taken for granted nature of history and anthropology, so that it doesn't just become a question of, history is about archives and anthropology is about fieldwork, and let's bring it together. It's about asking, why is it that historians and anthropologists used each other's techniques and materials only in selective, often tendentious ways? It is about asking, why did history and anthropology talk past one another and showed such limited understanding of each other's sensibilities? So it's to rethink, actually, the constituent disciplines which make up history and anthropology, namely history and anthropology. And this is actually to enter as well the question of what is it that we mean by archives and what is it that we mean by the field? Why is the archive such a fetish for the historian? And why is the fieldwork such a fetish for the anthropologist? And again, I'm making claims which seem to be provocative, but I'm actually standing on pretty solid ground. Because the conventional way of approaching historical anthropology, people saying, oh, historians saying, oh, we must move towards anthropology, anthropologists saying we must use history. Beyond that, I actually think that the kind of approach to or orientation to historical anthropology that I'm suggesting has actually found different configurations, particularly over the last 45, 50 years. Mm-hmm. So of course there were crucial statements which were made by people scholars such as Evans Pritchard, but I sort of see historical anthropology as crystallizing in work which drew upon, for example, drew upon the archive, drawing upon the archive or archives by anthropologists to address questions of culture, to address questions of meaning and practice. By historians drawing upon fieldwork sensibilities or anthropological sensibilities and modified forms of fieldwork to articulate issues of culture and power. Right? So you can already see, in some senses, anthropology is about culture. Mm-hmm. History is about processes. But now, in this body of work, there's been a shifting of gear. There has been a certain shift in sensibilities so that archives and fields themselves have been rethought. Now, I could give any number of references to this body of work, but this has become a very significant tendency, and it actually relates as well to how I address and articulate issues of subjects of modernity.
Well, Professor Doubé, this has all been extremely interesting. I think that the general public that is watching these programs now has some idea of the number of questions that you raise and the complexity of these. We're talking about subjects of modernity. It's a new book by Professor Doubé here at the Colegio de México, and we thank you very much for this conversation.
Well, thank you.